Hi everyone, I am Tyler Clift and my presentation today is on the role of frontal EEG asymmetry in post-traumatic stress disorder. So, as we discussed in class, electroencephalography or EEG is conducted by placing electrodes on a person's head. These electrodes then record naturally occurring electrical activity at the scalp. Frontal alpha asymmetry is a biomarker acquired through these EEG readings. It is associated with psychological adjustment, with more left-sided frontal activity predicting approach motivation and lower levels of depression and anxiety. These associations suggest its relevance to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is a disorder that develops in some people who have experienced firsthand or witnessed a traumatic event such as a severe accident, war, or assault. This study posited that state-dependent asymmetry during trauma stimulation differentiates PTSD patients from resilient individuals. So, the first methodological issue presented was that there are two distinct types of frontal asymmetry studies. The first type measures frontal asymmetry at a resting state and relates this asymmetry to individual differences. This measure is referred to as trait frontal asymmetry. In the second type of study, fluxes in EEG asymmetry are examined concerning manipulations that influence affective states. This measure is labeled state-dependent frontal asymmetry. During emotion processing, trait frontal asymmetry and state-dependent frontal asymmetry may produce information about individual differences in emotion, psychopathology, and possibly PTSD. The second methodological issue was the length and number of EEG recordings. The length of EEG recording is a crucial factor in the reliability of the frontal asymmetry measures. Essentially, one would expect that studies with longer recording periods deliver more reliable findings. The last issue presented was the reference scheme. Little evidence suggests that one reference scheme used in frontal asymmetry studies is better than the others. Differences between studies in the used reference schemes are often interpreted as a mere source of noise, though they may represent a serious threat to comparability of studies. But for this review, the researchers did not restrict the inclusion of studies to any particular reference scheme. In the selection of their studies, this review included all available peer-reviewed studies published in English that reported results of EEG asymmetry in humans where either all or a defined subgroup of participants were diagnosed with PTSD. The assessment of EEG asymmetry was required to be either a quantitative outcome variable or a quantitative factor correlated to PTSD symptoms. The researchers used the Web of Science online search engine to find relevant publications in their search strategy. Their approach generated 260 hits. First, they evaluated the relevance of publications by assessing titles and abstracts provided. Next, relevant studies were evaluated to determine whether they met the selection criteria. As a second strategy, citing and cited references of selected publications were assessed for relevance and were included when they met the requirements. In their data collection and analysis, the researchers divided the publications into studies that included frontal asymmetry as a trait-like variable versus state-dependent changes in frontal asymmetry. They collected sample characteristics from all studies, including time since the trauma, comorbidity, gender ratio, medication status, age, and methods used to diagnose PTSD or quantify PTSD symptoms. They also recorded the length of EEG recording and number of measurement occasions, the used reference scheme, the electrode sites used to assess frontal asymmetry, and reported procedural details that may be relevant for variation in motivational states during the EEG measurements. So, for their results, they found that all studies fulfilled their criteria included trait frontal asymmetry, while 2 also focused on state-dependent frontal asymmetry related to PTSD symptoms. Only 1 study found a relationship between trait frontal asymmetry and PTSD symptoms, with increased right-sided frontal activity predicting more severe symptoms. The 2 publications focusing on state-dependent frontal asymmetry found that higher right-sided frontal activation in response to trauma-related stimuli correlates with PTSD symptoms. Overall, this suggests that state frontal asymmetry during exposure to trauma-related catalysts may distinguish PTSD patients from resilient and trauma-free individuals, though evidence regarding trait frontal asymmetry remains inconclusive. The researchers also briefly looked into the connection between brain regions with fMRI. These images show a schematic model of the location of involved brain areas in the frontal cortex and pathways to the amygdala and hippocampus relevant for adapting to trauma in green and PTSD symptoms in red. This research shows that frontal asymmetry might be related to individual differences in cognitive emotion regulation and memory-relevant processes mediated by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC. It could also reflect individual differences in emotional responding and biased memory formation mediated by the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC, and the amygdala. It seemed that frontal asymmetry partly demonstrates the capability of the PFC to regulate the amygdala in a memory-guided and context-dependent way. The hippocampus is a crucial structure for the contextual integration of emotional memory. Its pathways to the right VMPFC and DLPFC may be necessary for inhibiting withdrawal and stress responses. As Panel C shows, poor functioning of these connections may increase the risk of developing PTSD symptoms compared to normal functioning laid out in Panel B. All in all, frontal asymmetry may reflect individual differences in neural networks and psychological mechanisms involved in the causation of PTSD. These findings suggest that an abnormal right-sided frontal activation might characterize PTSD patients responding to trauma-related stimuli, but not unrelated negative stimuli or activity at rest. Right-sided frontal activation in response to trauma-related stimuli might be an effect of exaggerated negative information processing and autonomic and neuroendocrine stress reactions mediated by the right VMPFC and amygdala. A route for future research is to examine the role of frontal asymmetry in trauma-related symptoms that are specific to PTSD, such as flashbacks and dissociative amnesia. Some promising avenues for the continuation of frontal asymmetry research presented in this article are refining the measurement of frontal asymmetry, combining EEG with other types of cognitive neuroscience techniques, and other intervention techniques such as EEG neurofeedback. And here are the references for this PowerPoint. Thank you so much for viewing my presentation. Have a good day and a great spring break.